It was supposed to be one of those fun, spur-of-the-moment type things. Something spontaneous. A last-minute activity that my wife and I could experience together. We definitely experienced something, all right. And I doubt we'll ever take one of those tours ever again in our lives. As you know, October is in full swing with the horrific holiday just around the corner. My wife lives for this kind of stuff. Every year we seem to do the same exact things. Grab some pumpkins to carve at the local pumpkin patch. Decorate our house together. Participate in the many bar costume contests around the city. And even brave a haunted house or two. I was never really a fan of the latter. Simply because they weren't all that scary to me. I'm not just trying to sound super macho or anything like that. It's just, you've been to one haunted house, you've been to them all. You can only see so many fake dead bodies and rubber masks before you become numb to the whole event. My wife Nikki absolutely loved them, however. She'd beg me year after year to go to as many as we could. And I'd reluctantly agree. Whatever makes her happy, right? However, this year she wanted to try something new and different. I remember getting home late in the evening from work, and when I was barely even through the front door, she slapped a flyer into my hands. She said her friend from work had a few of these flyers and were handing them out. I slumped my exhausted body onto my couch and glanced over the flyer in my hand. Across the top it said, "Experience fear unlike any other. Come face to face with the paranormal, if you're brave enough." It then went on to detail that this was a flyer for a real-life ghost tour. Basically, a guide takes a group of people through a well-known haunted house, detailing the past misfortunes of the owners. And if you're lucky, you might get to see a real-life ghost yourself. So, in layman's terms, it was a con. They lure curious patrons in with the flyer. Then they get the money, flicker the lights a bit, and you go home wondering why the hell you even went there in the first place. Those were my thoughts on the matter, and I told her as much. I was actually surprised when she agreed with me, but said it was only $20, and even if it was all fake, we could still laugh at their attempts. After hearing her point of view, I mulled it over for a bit, and ultimately agreed to it. The day finally arrived for us to take part in our first ever real-life ghost tour. We headed out just before dark and experienced our first real horror of the night. Parking. Trust me, if you ever had to find parking in a city on a Friday night, you know what I mean. Luckily, we didn't spend too long searching and found a lot fairly close to our destination. During our walk over to the haunted house, we joked back and forth about what horrors this place had in store for us. I bet my wife $5 that the lights will flicker, and she said she'd take that bet. Then proceeded to bet me that the doors in the house would slam shut repeatedly. We both laughed at our skepticism, and before we knew it, we were standing in front of the house itself. It was an older-looking house, tucked away in a small back street from the rest of the city. I wondered why we had to park so far away from this place. Then I noticed the no parking sign encompassing the entire street. I thought that was pretty odd, but cities seem to do that quite a lot. Just as I was mulling over that thought, a voice behind me said, "It's 'cause of the house." Caught off guard, I quickly spun around and was face to face with an older man. His face was withered. His clothing was slightly wrinkled and looked to be a decade old. My wife asked him what he meant by that, and the old man continued. "For many years, people used to park on this street, and during that time, their batteries would all be drained by the time they returned," he said. "It was all unexplainable. But eventually, the city just posted those signs to save people the trouble of calling a mechanic." I then asked him if he was part of the ghost tour for the house. He just chuckled slightly under his breath before saying, "You'd never catch me in that house." He then nodded goodbye to both of us and walked away. My wife and I both looked at each other and thought the same thing, that he was one of those planted actors to scare the patrons. Pretty convincing, I thought. We walked inside the house, and in the foyer we were greeted by a young man. He wore a dated business suit. I'm assuming to make the whole experience more authentic. As he approached, I noticed that my wife and I were the only patrons here. I asked him where everyone was, and his response made me start to regret this decision. He said it was a slow night, that not many people want to experience this sort of thing. I was about ready to head home when my wife turned to me and said, "We're already here, we might as well do it." I caved once again, and handed the man the admission. He quickly pocketed the cash and a smile appeared on his face. He looked like he was about to sell me a rock and tell me it was gold. He led us inward to the house and regaled us with its original owners. The house itself was built in the early 1900s by a businessman by the name of J.P. Baker. He said that Baker was a ruthless businessman. He'd cut corners in his factories just to save a quick buck, and this ultimately cost the lives of numerous employees. This mattered not to Mr. Baker, as he was wealthy, and the gripes of some low-class workers were beneath him. That was until the state caught up with him, and after multiple safety inspections, they shut down his factories until further notice. Mr. Baker's wealth quickly began to diminish, and this realization drove him to madness. The man led us to an upstairs bedroom and opened the door. He said Mr. Baker came home one night, fueled on whiskey, and put a bullet in the head of his wife, Francine Baker. When he said that, the light in the room flickered on and off. I felt my wife hand me $5 behind my back, and a sly grin crept across my face. He then led us out of the room and down the hall, and not 5 steps away, the door behind us slammed shut. I rubbed my eyes in an attempt to stave off the laughter and handed Nikki her $5 back. He cracked open the door and said Mr. Baker's daughter was asleep in this room. Mr. Baker walked up, gently caressed her face before ending her life in the same manner as his wife. Finally, we made it to the last room, the son's room. The guide said that young Jacob Baker, age 14, had been stirred from his sleep by the loud gunshots. When his father entered, Jacob attacked him, trying to pry the gun from his father's hands. In the commotion, the gun was tossed across the room. Mr. Baker then pulled out his knife and stabbed the boy in the neck. The guide then pointed to the floor, where a slight discoloration was in the wood, to indicate blood staining. Mr. Baker then retrieved his revolver and pressed it to his temple before ending his life. Even if this was all just a con, the story was pretty intriguing at least. The guide then stepped out of the room, and before we could follow, the door slammed shut in front of us. I told Nikki she wasn't getting any more cash out of me, and she just smirked. Then I felt the air around us begin to drop in temperature, and the lights in the room shut off. Suddenly, there was a knock on the other side of the door. Our guide was still there and asked us if we were all right. I told him it was a nice trick, but if he could let us out now, that'd be great. He then said it wasn't a trick, and when he said that, I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like a footstep. Nikki turned first and screamed at the top of her lungs. This caused me to turn as well. A man stood in front of us, though only the upper half of his body was visible. He was an older man with gray hair and a large hole in the side of his head. He took a step towards us, and I instinctively put myself between whatever it was and my wife. She spun around and began to pound on the door, demanding we be let out. The closer this thing got to me, the more details I could make out. The sweat on the forehead, the bags under the eyes from a night of drinking, and the distinct smell of gunpowder in the air. I put my arm out to shove him back, but my hand passed right through his chest. I thought maybe he was some sort of fancy hologram, but that was quickly washed away when he grabbed me and threw me across the room. I crashed into a couple of chairs and landed on the floor. He was getting closer to my wife. My fight response was kicking in, and just as I was about to stand up, something grabbed me. A small hand. A boy's hand. I looked down and saw the pale face of a boy. His eyes were pleading for help. He opened his mouth to speak, but only blood poured from his lips. When this happened, the man turned to face us. I summoned all the courage I could and charged through him, past my wife, and crashed through the door. When I did, the lights in the room came back on, and the others in the room had vanished. The guide appeared panicked and asked us again and again if we were all right. I just grabbed my wife's hand and we left that house as fast as possible. There are plenty things to do in October, but going on one of those tours isn't something I'd recommend. If I were you, I'd stick to good old-fashioned fake haunted houses from now on, just like we plan on doing.